if the mission of God is not at work in you, it cannot be at work through you. It's a really important principle. You cannot take somebody any further than you've gone yourself. You cannot help somebody to find Christ if you don't know Christ. That's obvious, it sounds, doesn't it? But even then, as you take people on and develop them deeper in the Christian faith, you cannot go any deeper than you have gone. We have an amazing task ahead of us. And when I think about what I'd like to see, what I pray for, the vision, the dreams of what we could be doing as a church, of where we could be today, I look at it and I think, how? It is just such a huge mountain to climb. It's too big. But let's break it down step by step. And the first step is that we have to look at ourselves. Peter was writing to a missional church. They were so missional that they got the attention of none other than Caesar himself. In this case, it was Nero. I'm not going to bore you with that because we went through 1 Peter a year or so back, and I bludgeoned you with stories of Nero and and all about him back in AD 68. And the long and the short of it is this, that Nero, or somebody, but probably Nero, set fire to Rome, burnt the place down, and then blamed the Christians for it, because he hated them, absolutely hated them. Why did he hate them? Because they were making a difference. They weren't just a sect that refused to acknowledge him as Lord. They wouldn't say Caesar is Lord, but they were actually making a difference. They were gaining converts, and people were turning to Christ, to a different Lord. That's what upset him, is that the attention was being turned away from him, from the gods that he worshipped. And he wanted to get rid of them at any price. So blame the Christians. They scatter. And Peter is writing to those scattered Christians who have gone out, in this case, over towards modern-day Turkey. And he's writing, and he wrote his first letter in about AD 65, and this one probably followed shortly afterwards, probably still in the same year, maybe into the next. But he's following it up, he's backing it up, the first letter, with a second one. And he wants them to remain a missional people. He wants them to remain not people who are just feeling sorry for themselves because they've been displaced from their homes, because their cities have been burned down, and what's more, now they are being persecuted, they're being arrested, they're being fed to the lions, they're being strapped to stakes covered in pitch and set fire to make lights in Nero's garden. That's the persecution they were under. And he says, don't feel sorry for yourselves. In fact, he doesn't even mention it here, does he? As we start this letter, he doesn't say, I know you've gone through a hard time. He says, come on, we've got to get on. And so he says this, his divine power has given us everything we need for a life and godliness. His divine power. You think you're going through a hard time? You feel like giving up? You feel it's like such a big mountain to cross? You're beginning to wonder why you ever became a follower of Jesus, given all the persecution you're going through. His divine power has given you everything you need to continue. And as we read from verse 3 to verse 4, the whole lot there could be summarized in this, it seems to me, that he's talking here about faith. This is your faith he's talking about. The divine power that gives you everything we need for life and godliness. What is that? That's the life of faith. Through the knowledge of him, the knowledge of Jesus, that is, who called us by his own glory and goodness. What's that? That's talking about the life of faith again. Through these, that's his glory and his goodness, he has given us his very great and precious promises. The word great there means absolutely the best, the exceedingly greatest of all his promises. And precious means most costly, valuable promises. He's given those to you. that you may participate in the divine nature. Not that you become a little God, as some pastors in recent years have concluded. He's not saying that you actually become God, but he's saying that God, or God's life, the divine nature, takes root in you. You become different. You become like him. You don't become him. And as a result of doing that, he says you then escape the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. You escape sin. He says you actually overcome the temptations. Isn't that wonderful? You can overcome all of that. And he says that's what happens to you. No matter what you face, no matter what you're going through, no matter how big the mountain seems to be, he says that he's given you all of that, and that is faith. He has placed faith in you, given you the ability to believe. Because actually, our faith, it's not actually so much about us deciding to believe in him, but it's him opening our eyes that we can believe. Because the story of Jesus, the account of what he's done, is one of the most unbelievable facts on earth. There are some pretty unbelievable things in this world, but I would say that the story that this great creator God became a human being, gave his life, and as a result, we now have an everlasting life, sounds almost like fairy story. Who's going to believe that? But that's what we preach. That's what we tell people. And Peter says, hang on to that. Even though it still sounds unbelievable, faith is believing in what you cannot see. You have received promises, you've not received the final thing, Peter is saying. It's the promises you've received. Your faith is based on promises. Hebrews tells us that Abraham is the father of all those who have faith. Why? Because he believed in the promise. God makes the promise to Abraham, and he believed it, even though he never ever received. Does that mean that God was unfaithful to them? No, because God's promise was to him and his offspring. All those who have faith are the children of Abraham. And therefore, that when we have faith to trust in the Lord, that we also we're children of Abraham through Jesus. In other words, we're the children of faith. And as a result of that, having been adopted into God's family, because we are unnatural children of God, but we're adopted into his family, and that he enables us then to believe and to trust in him, he says, you've got the faith. But the thing is that you can have faith, and you can leave it there if you want to. Or you can do something with it. Your faith can grow. That's why the Bible says that if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can tell this mountain, Jesus says, to get up and go and move yourself into the sea. Can you imagine that? A mustard seed was a tiny little seed. And he says, that's all. Did he mean that tiny little faith will move the mountain? No, what he meant was that the tiny little seed of faith grows into a big thing. That's why he says that the mustard seed starts off as a tiny seed and it grows into a plant. Not so much here in the UK, but in Israel, the mustard they had grew into a plant. It says even the birds sit in its branches. Now, when I go into the supermarket and buy my little carton of cress or mustard, and I see these things, that are standing, a couple of inches tall, and I think to myself, my goodness, how on earth is a bird going to sit in that? Well, obviously it's a different thing he's talking about. He's talking about something that grows into a big plant. Let's not get too hung up on the words. The point is that your faith starts off very basic, but you can add to it. Let me give you a quick illustration. If you want a chair, we could start with, very basically, we could just cut a log, couldn't we? A round of a tree, stick it in your home, flat on both sides so it sits evenly on the floor and you can sit on the top. That's a basic seat. You could have that, couldn't you? But most of us would not be content with just having a log to sit on. So we could develop it further, couldn't we? And we could kind of just take a piece of the log, a thin piece, and we could put 4 legs on it and make a stool out of it. And we could sit on a stool. We could take it a stage further and we could put a back to it so that you've got something to rest on your back. And we could make it into a chair, something like this, just a wooden chair. It's nothing special about that, really. It's just a bit of wood, 4 legs, a seat and a back. But actually that's going to get pretty uncomfortable, so we could take that a stage further. And we could pad it so that it's actually a little bit more comfortable. And depending on the length of the sermon, the more padding you'll need. But, you can make it a little bit more comfortable, can't you? So we could also put some arms on it, maybe. So you've got something to rest on, some arms. That would be better, wouldn't it? Then, of course, we could actually make it so that maybe the back can move a little bit, so you can recline a bit, so you can just get it right to where you are, and then you could put a footrest onto it. You could make it a bit wider. You could make it even softer. You can make it, and before you know it, you've got one of these most super duper armchair things that people have in their homes. All from the idea that we started with a log, a piece of a tree that we were sitting on. Now, what's your faith like? Do you want the basics? Do you want just the plain log, as is described here in verses 1 to 3? Or do you want to take it even further? Because you can. Because look what he says in in verses 3 to 4. But in verse 5, he takes it further. For this reason, make every effort to add to your faith. He says, don't just be satisfied with saying, I'm saved and that's enough. He says, there's so much more. If you really want to live the godly life, he says, there is so much more that's available to you. Make every effort to add to your faith goodness and knowledge and self-control and perseverance and godliness and brotherly kindness and love. All of those 7 qualities, he said, you can add to it. So that it's more than just a basic faith. Hey, it's my ticket into heaven. If you take that attitude, that's really sad and poor. We don't just want a ticket into glory. We say, I want to live life in all its fullness here and now. But how can I do that when I look at what it means to be like Jesus, to be transformed more and more into his likeness? I think, wow, this is too big for me. How can I possibly cope? Well, how you cope is this. You do it not through your own strength, but you do it through his. He breaks the task down for you. For a start, it's not about your effort, it's about his divine power. It's the power of Jesus at work in you. So you let him work. You cannot save yourself. How are you saved? It's through the blood of Jesus, his sacrifice. The fact that he came and stood in your place. That's nothing you did. You did nothing at all to bring your salvation into being. It's everything that he did. That's the first thing. How does he do that? Well, if we look again, it's through the knowledge of him. And this word knowledge, it's an interesting word, the word knowledge. The word knowledge, actually here, there are 2 words being used for knowledge in this passage. There is one sort of a fairly basic word, which we've spoken about at different times. It's the word gnosis. It's an understanding. It's just some basic knowledge about something. You can have an understanding of all sorts of things. But here the word prefixes it with the word epi. And it seems that when the word epi is used, it means great, full, wide, deep. It's an extreme version of knowledge. It's not just understanding, it's total understanding. So, how do you bring about the life of godliness through the divine power that gave you everything and made it available to you? The power is always there. It's up to you whether you tap into that or not. It's, there is no such thing as a power cut where God is concerned. The power is always available, but are you plugged in? Because when you're plugged into him and ready to receive and to trust and to believe, then we come to this knowledge. It's through the knowledge of him who called us, our knowledge of him, our total knowledge, our deep knowledge, our intimate knowledge of him. And we're not talking just about head knowledge here, we're talking about real understanding of who Jesus is and everything he's achieved for you. How deep do you go with Jesus? If you're satisfied with having, well, I know who he is, I know what he's done, and I say my prayers, and I even might read my Bible a few times a week. But that's just going through the motions. Do you have a deep understanding of him? Do you know his heart? Because that's what we're looking for. To say, I really understand him. This is a personal, one-to-one understanding of Jesus. How does he do that? Because he has called us. Remember, notice there that he has called us, not we came to him. Jesus called. I don't want to get too bogged down here in terms, but I did find it fascinating to look at this word called as well, because the word called means to shout out loud. It is an invitation to you out loud by name. And that's important too, by name. It's not just a general call. Anybody who wants to come here now. But he's calling you by name, individually. He calls your name. And he does it out loud. And that means not audibly, not so you can necessarily hear it, but what he's saying here is that this is not just some kind of, I think he wants me. It's not God's will that any should perish, that all should come to a saving knowledge. If you kind of take that attitude and say, therefore it must mean me too, that's okay. But very specifically, God will call you in your testimony. When you tell somebody how you came to faith, what is your story going to be? Is it, I went to church all my life and, and I just kind of slipped into it? Is that kind of your faith? Or can you put your finger on the point where you can say that one day I just knew that he had his hand on my life, that he had called me personally, that the gospel was for me, that I was the sinner, that my sins were forgiven, and that he wanted me, that he loved me. Because you really need to have that understanding. And to say it's more than just a cultural Christianity that I belong to. It's a very personal faith. God has called you by name. Jesus went along the shore at Galilee and he picked out his disciples. Hey, Peter, come and follow me. Hey, John, come and follow me. He called them by name. He picked them as individuals and said, come and follow me. He still does the same. He calls you individually by name. And when he calls you, how does he do it? By his own glory and his goodness. His glory here is something that is visible, something that is bright, something that is shining, something that is dazzling. And the thing about Jesus was that when he called his disciples to him and they followed him, why did they keep following him? Because they saw something in him that set him apart from every other teacher. There was something amazing about him. And the very fact that he was the Son of God was proved time and time again by the power of God at work in him. That was the dazzling, glorious bit, that God was at work in his life. And when you come face to face with Jesus, do you see a good teacher? Somebody who's very moral, somebody whose teachings would just help this world to be a better place? Or do you see someone who is full of the divine power of God? Because if that's the kind of God that you see, the Jesus that you see, someone who's, then you're on the right track. If you're just seeing him as, well, he was a kind of a nice sort of guy who just did good things, you know, and he was just, yeah, that's not enough. We want to see something glorious in Jesus, not something that's good, something that's glorious. But he takes it a stage further, because he says he doesn't call you just by his glory, but he calls you also, notice here, by his goodness. And this word goodness here is quite a difficult one, isn't it, to understand. What does goodness actually mean? Jesus was approached by the man who said to him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit?" "Why do you call me good?" Jesus said. "Only God is good." What did he mean by that? In what sense is God good and only good? Because goodness is found in God, at least goodness in these terms. The goodness here is talking about a godliness, a godlikeness. It's talking about a moral godliness in character. So what it's really saying here is that Jesus called his disciples and he dazzled them by the divine power that's in him, that they looked at him and said, he can be none other than the Son of God. Look at that. And then they looked at his character and they said that his character backs it up. He's no fraud. He's not taking us for a ride here. This is genuine. Look at his life. Look at his character. Look at his personality. It oozes the life of God. And we too should be looking at Jesus saying, not only is he just so magnificent and amazing, and we're just stunned by the brightness of his glory, but we are absolutely captured by his personality and saying, I'd love to be just like Jesus. I want to think like him. I want to speak like him. I want to act like him, to feel like him. I want to be like Jesus. And that's what the disciples found. They found that even though Jesus was sometimes seemingly harsh with them, he did nothing to harm them, but only to bring them to a better place. So if you can accept Jesus, that Jesus, in all his glory and his goodness, that when you look at it, it causes you to say, I just want to trust in him. He says, now here's the wonderful bit, that if you become more and more like Jesus, you're going to need some help, because he's on a mountain so high that you cannot possibly get there, or at least not on your own. Now this is where your bit comes in. See, notice that up to this point, it's all about what he does for you, that it was by his power, his glory, his goodness, and the knowledge of him, understanding him, going deeper into him. But it's everything about he's revealing to us. And that's your basic faith. Now he says, let's start climbing that mountain. Let's become like Jesus. Let's actually transform ourselves now from the basic Christian, the wooden chair, into something that's spectacular. How do we do that? For this very reason, make every effort, that's effort on your part, not his part, make every effort to add to your faith. He says, you've got the basics, now start to clothe it, to pack it out. And what are you going to pack it out with? Faith. Well, you've already got that, haven't you? We've already talked about it, but we want to add to your faith. We want you to believe even more and to trust even more. Goodness, well, we talked about that as being that moral character. Your moral character needs to change. So you make every effort. Sometimes it's hard work, isn't it? Sometimes you have to look at yourself, keep yourself in check. But how can you keep yourself in check? Well, That's okay because you get knowledge. And this knowledge is an understanding, not just any old knowledge, but it's a deeper knowledge of Jesus, his teaching, who he is, etc. And once you start to apply that knowledge, which is now changing your character as well, because you're understanding how you should live as a Christian, but temptations are going to come and it's going to be a difficult battle. So he gives you self-control. And self-control is all about just being in total command over everything you say, you do, you think. So you keep bringing yourself into check all the time. When you step out of line, you're the one who's responsible for that. You're the one who brings yourself back and says, I should not have said that. I need to do something about that. Hopefully, eventually you'll get there before the words even come out of your mouth, you stop them. Before the action occurs, you stop it. That's what we're aiming for, self-control. Perseverance, because it's hard work. You need to keep going. We're not talking about something that lasts for a week or a month or even a year. We're talking for a lifetime. You need to work hard at it, and sometimes that's difficult. That's where perseverance comes in. And then there's this thing, godliness. Godliness. Well, godliness is that character of God himself. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of explaining, does it? But actually what you're looking at is you're saying, who do I want to be like? Am I copying somebody else? And that's all right in the early years of being a Christian, but ultimately you've got to look to him and say, I want to be just like him. And so I want the character of God in me, and I'm going to make every effort to do that. And to that, he says, brotherly kindness. And this is a word that you'll probably be familiar with if you go around the supermarkets and go to the cheese aisle. You will eventually come across Philadelphia. Well, that's the word here, brotherly kindness, Philadelphia. We know it's a place in America too, and it was a place out in modern-day Turkey. There was a place called Philadelphia. So Philadelphia, but it actually means brotherly kindness. From philo, love, and adelphos, meaning brother. Philadelphia. But what it's saying here, it's talking about a mutual love. So just as, no matter what happens in a family, brothers and sisters, what should happen is that sometimes brothers and sisters get on very well together. And there is that mutual concern for each other. And sometimes they get on one another's nerves. And there's a little bit of a falling out. But we hope it doesn't last for long. Because you forgive each other, you just get back to it, and you carry on again. And the bonds between siblings is meant to be so strong that nothing will tear it apart. That's how it should be in the church, because we are called to be brothers and sisters in Christ. And so we want to have that mutual love and affection for each other that is so strong. Sadly, sometimes things do break down on one side or the other. There's no doubt about that. In families, that happens. It's very sad, isn't it, when families split? And in the church, sometimes that happens too. But that's where the final one comes in, love. What is the difference between brotherly kindness, brotherly love, and love, agape? Agape is the kind of love that God has for you. It is an unconditional love. It is not about mutual love because we love because God first loved us. That's not mutual. That's not Philadelphia. This love, agape, is different. It says, I will love you regardless of whether you love me back. And we've got to do that to the people around us. We say, whether you love me back or not, I've still got to love you. And I will love you. And I will have concern for you and care for you. And he says, that's the kind of thing you've got to add to it. You've got to have all of those things. And if you have all of those things in an ever-increasing measure, ever-increasing measure, it will stop you from becoming, here's another word that you'll be familiar with, argos. Now, I know you think that's a shop, don't you? But it means ineffective. Goodness knows why they called it argos. Having bought a few things from there, actually I might know why. Moving swiftly on, but it will keep you from being ineffective in your faith. Argos. But it will also keep you from being unproductive. Similar things, really. Ineffective that you just do nothing, unproductive that you produce nothing. We don't just want you to be idle Christians, sitting there doing nothing, just with the basic faith, your ticket through the pearly gates. We want you to be much more than that. We want you to be effective Christians who are being transformed inside of you, and productive Christians who are bearing the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of the Christian life. That's what we want you to be. And then he rounds it all off by saying, if you can do all of these things, he says, then you will not be like a nearsighted person, a short-sighted person who needs these things that I have to wear all the time. Take them off and you grope around. He says, that's what you're going to be like if you don't apply these things. If you do, he says, you can see into the distance. You can see for the future. You can see where you're going. You can see as much, at least, as is being revealed to you. But it makes you wise. It means you make good decisions. It means that you are always thinking ahead. It means that it guards your life. That's the productive, effective Christian life. And it means, finally, as he says there, that if you don't do this, and if you do become blind as Christians, never ever looking out to the future, never looking forward in your Christian life, he says, then you've forgotten that your past has been forgiven. Every wrong thing you've done is cleansed. What sort of Christian do you want to be? Mission starts at home. It starts with me. It starts with you. You've got to get those things right inside of you in order for him to work through you. Let's just pray.